Hi, Lester, Wish You Engineer. I trust that you've all been well. My last video was fairly well received and I got quite a few good comments and questions from my viewers. Many of them I could answer simply enough in the comments section, but some included suggestions for follow-up videos. I always consider video suggestions seriously. However, some are achievable while others may be either too costly in terms of resources, and that includes time for me, or may just not be something that I'm interested in pursuing at the time that the suggestion is made. No, that's not meant as some kind of an insult. I'm sure that you can understand that for a pursuit like this channel, like my channel, which doesn't actually offer any kind of financial incentive for me, I have to be personally interested and invested in a particular research idea to pursue it. That's a rather long way of me saying that I don't usually generate content that is purely intended to drive views. A simple glance at the low numbers of views on some of the very long and complex videos that took a lot of work on our part to put together is enough to confirm that. My channel is not what you would class as clickbait. I create content that interests me personally, and I'm happy to see that there is a small but growing community of folks that share my weird and wonderful interests and who may be benefiting from my videos. Now, this video is meant as a follow-up onto my previous video, which compared the nunchaku and the stick or flute using one-handed and two-handed striking methods. And although no one in particular requested this particular content, the content I'm addressing in this video, in the comment section to that previous video of mine, there have been a few questions over the years that I've fielded on my videos that demonstrate that the concept of apparent mass behind a strike or associated with a strike is quite poorly understood. In fact, I have actually read through legitimate sports science papers that have demonstrated the author's lack of understanding of the concept of apparent mass in human striking. Some authors, one in particular, actually assumed that the mass behind a boxer's strike is simply the mass of the boxer's arm. As such, I decided to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, and do a full comprehensive analysis of a two-handed push strike performed with a flute or a stick, in addition to analyzing the striking characteristics of a flute traveling at the same velocity as the push strike, but without me holding onto it at the point of impact. This was meant as a partial answer to one of my viewers who suggested constructing a machine to throw one half of a nunchaku against the test equipment at the same velocity as my strike, and then to analyze the differences in striking characteristics between the thrown half nunchaku and my nunchaku strike. This was actually a good suggestion, and this particular video, the one that I'm doing now, is a blatant cop-out to avoid building a nunchuck chucking machine while still kind of addressing the question in a way. How much chuck could half a nunchuck chuck if half a nunchuck could chuck chuck? I suppose the answer may be that no one can chuck chuck except Mr. Chuck Norris himself. Anyway, lame jokes aside, those of you who train in one or more stick fighting systems will no doubt be familiar with at least one variant of a two-handed push strike. It's often a short-range strike. One could call it a weapon version almost of a short-range punch, like a 1-inch punch. And it typically involves striking out and recruiting a lot of the whole body strength and engagement. Typically involves placing both hands on the stick with a gap between the hands and striking at the target with the length of stick between the two hand grip positions. This grip allows a more connected and stable structure through the arms to help with bridging and efficient transmission of force and energy generated by the whole body movement. Because of the relatively short, restricted range of the strike and its simple linear nature though, in whatever configuration you employ it, it could be said to suffer from a lack of acceleration and impact velocity when compared to a more conventional strike using a swinging arc, for instance. So if it suffers from a theoretical lack of velocity, why even use it as a strike? Well, there's always the consideration that in the heat of a combat situation, one must be able to strike from any angle and at any range and still achieve significant results. This is one of the features of any good combat-oriented fighting system, including combat-oriented kung fu training. The goal is to outfit the practitioner to operate optimally in the most suboptimal conditions. And these suboptimal conditions can include limited range, limited visibility, limited time, pain, exhaustion, confusion, disorientation, etc., to be able to deal with asymmetrically extreme threats. Personally, I don't train to defend myself against the average belligerent drunk at a bar, or to strut around like an alpha male, or to teach people life lessons, or to establish trivial social dominance. Instead, I train to survive situations that are both extreme and egregious. However, surely there's more to the two-handed push strike than just being able to strike effectively from short range. Well, I believe that there is, and it involves impulse and apparent mass. But instead of simply holding an opinion and putting together a lively internet argument to entertain and or infuriate the masses, I believe in putting my money where my mouth is and demonstrating real results under scientific test conditions. I always try to avoid going full opinion. Scientific results, while never as sensational as the claims that some people make, are far more compelling to me personally because they represent something far closer to reality than someone's opinion. Before I go any further, I should first elaborate on one of the outcomes I hope to achieve in this video. Apparent mass, as I've discussed in many other videos, is that part of the mass of the human weapon system that is involved in the impact when striking. It's not simply the mass of the weapon used in the strike, although many people still seem to believe that it is. A skilled weapon wielder can typically manipulate the apparent mass associated with their strike by providing additional force, delivered rapidly at the same time as the impact occurs. By the end of this video, I hope to have provided you with sufficient test results to demonstrate for once and for all that my connection to the target through the weapon plays a significant role in the amount of force, impulse, and energy in a strike. So to discuss the methodology, the striking technique that I'm going to use in my test is pretty simple and direct. However, getting the body to engage effectively to optimize what is apparently a simple strike is not as easy as it may seem. And the technique looks a little bit like that. I'm going to perform two separate sets of tests using the same technique. Firstly, I'm going to do the strike conventionally by holding onto the flute or the stick at the point of impact as a baseline comparison for this video and for future videos. I'm then going to perform the strike again in the same way using the same biomechanics, but I will let go of the stick just prior to impact so that the stick leaves my hands and strikes the test equipment on its own without my body behind it to manipulate the apparent mass. Now I should briefly discuss the test equipment and the test methodology used to provide a comprehensive analysis of the striking characteristics. And my apologies if you've heard this all before, but for those who are new to the channel, the impulse block method that we are going to use in this video allows for one of the most comprehensive analyses of human striking available currently to our knowledge. Our impulse block method is currently being independently tested for validity and reliability as part of a study by another researcher from the University of Southern Queensland. In a nutshell, the impulse block equipment consists of a specially designed foam spring called the impulse block attached to the front face of a load cell that records force input at a sampling rate of approximately 1 kilohertz, along with a laser photogate timer that allows the measurement of time of flight in microseconds across a 1 centimeter gap just prior to impact with the impulse block. Using the measured values from the force time data plot produced by the load cell, along with the time of flight of the impacting object just prior to impact, it becomes possible to calculate a number of characteristics associated with the impacting object. These characteristics include impulse, or change in momentum imparted by the strike, impact velocity, peak equivalent impact force, kinetic energy of the impact, power of the impact, and apparent or effective mass behind the strike. Please note that, as I mentioned previously in this video, apparent or effective mass is not simply the mass of the weapon or part of my body involved in the strike. It is calculated from the impulse value and is actually that part of the mass of the human subject weapon system that is involved in the impact. For a more detailed explanation of the impulse block equipment and methodology, I'll refer you to, I recommend that you see my other videos speaking specifically on the subject. In some of my previous videos involving the impulse block method, we have shown only half the total impulse value on our tables because this is what is used to calculate other values such as kinetic energy, apparent mass, and power. As such, when we compare the results obtained in this video to our previous results, we'll provide both the half impulse values and the full impulse values for easy comparison. I should also briefly explain the concept of peak equivalent impact force, which is a new characteristic that we're introducing for the first time in this video to the suite of impact characteristics calculated using the impulse block method. Peak equivalent impact force is simply a predicted force peak calculated based on fitting the impulse data into the typical force time curve of a 7 kilogram medicine ball impacting the load cell from a height of approximately 1 meter with a thin EVA foam mat placed on the load cell front plate. As I've explained in previous videos, the impact force is very dependent on the physical characteristics of both the impacting object and the surface that the object impacts. Soft objects of a particular weight traveling at a certain velocity impacting on soft surfaces will yield relatively low impact forces with relatively long impact durations as the objects contort and elastically deform or inelastically deform during the impact. Whereas hard objects of identical weight and impact velocity impacting hard surfaces will generate much higher impact forces with much shorter impact durations, so the peaks are a lot steeper and narrower. In both cases, the impulse will be identical, but in the case of the hard objects, the impulse will be squashed into a narrower impact peak with a higher peak force and a shorter impact duration. So think about, for instance, as a common analogy, think about a hammer. A hammer doesn't necessarily weigh too much, but when you strike a hard object with a hammer, let's say a nail with a hammer, it produces a very sharp impact peak which drives the nail into the wood. Now imagine taking an object of the same weight as the hammer, but different physical characteristics. So let's say, for instance, a rubber ball, or even a rubber hammer, for instance, made completely out of rubber, and striking that nail with the same velocity, it's going to have a different result. It may not actually drive the nail into the wood at all because the impact peak is essentially much broader and much lower. So you don't get the same kind of impact impacting force. And of course, what I should also mention here is that no scientific test would be complete without mentioning the sources of error. Although it's not typically considered a source of error in sports science, my natural human performance variation far eclipses the scale of variation and error introduced by other sources. Relative to natural human performance variation, the scale of equipment measurement error is so small in this case that it can typically safely be ignored. I should mention also that the equipment used in these tests has also been independently calibrated by the University of Southern Queensland and is also currently forming the focus of a separate study during which it's being used, also by the University of Southern Queensland. Nevertheless, it should be noted that due to harmonic distortion and harmonic losses in the load cell impulse block equipment, there is an error associated with the calculation of impulse that typically ranges between 1 and 10% of the expected value. Lastly, we should acknowledge that a very small sample size was used in this case. Only 5 tests for the conventional two-handed push strike and 5 tests for the two-handed push throw. This small sample size can often lead to errors. And after that brief discussion of methodology, this is what the tests looked like. So, welcome to the testing part of the video. As you can see, I've got the center portion of the stick or flute wrapped with high density foam, again to protect the equipment. And I'm going to be striking again from a low stance, striking forward like so, and we'll see what kind of results we get from that testing.
Are you ready?
1871.
And when you're ready.
1843.
And when you're ready.
1784. 1829. So in the next set of tests, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to replicate that strike, but instead of hanging on to the flute at the moment of impact, I'm actually going to let go and let it essentially fly out of my hands and strike the impulse block on its own. I'm going to try and get the velocity to be the same, and we'll see what kind of an impact the apparent mass that I generate behind those strikes is going to have on the results, because hopefully I can get the velocities to be identical, and the only factor that will be different is either me driving that force in or me not driving that force in. So it should be interesting. We'll see.
Okay, when you're ready. 168.
Yeah, that's pretty close. It's 1689.
And when you're ready.
1790. Pretty close.
I can see the waveform looks quite different.
We might only do a couple more tests like this. 1941.
Yeah, that technique was good.
The other's a bit chaotic.
Yeah, when you're ready.
A little bit slower.
Do a couple more.
That was about it. 178.2. I think that should be enough for us to do a comparison.
Yeah, so you've done 5, and they're roughly, I think the average would be about
The
same.
average would be about the same.
Yeah.
After compiling and analyzing the data for the strikes, this is what the average characteristics looked like. Some of the compelling characteristics of the push strike are its extremely high apparent mass, impulse, and surprisingly, also kinetic energy. This was surprising to me because I was well aware of how much slower these kinds of strikes are in comparison to conventional swinging strikes. The push strike achieved an average velocity of only 5.46 meters per second. As a comparison, my fastest bare hand strikes typically range at around 10, 11, 12 meters per second, while the average impact velocity for a stick swinging strike ranges at around 18 or 19 meters per second. However, the push strikes are still strikes and not simply pushes because they have significant impact velocity and convey significant kinetic energy. The impact duration was much longer for these kinds of strikes though, being over 5 times longer than the impact duration of a typical conventional stick swing strike. The kinetic energy of the two-handed push strike was nearly as high as that of the two-handed baseball bat style swing used in my previous video, despite the much lower impact velocity. In addition, impulse was over 5 times higher for the two-handed push strike than for the conventional baseball bat style swinging strike. This much higher impulse is one of the features of the two-handed push strike that make it quite attractive in close quarters fighting. Of course, impulse is change in momentum. The higher impulse generated in a push strike can be used to manipulate opponents with the strike more effectively. So either knocking them back, for instance, knocking them to the ground, or if constrained in some way, potentially breaking bones due to the attendant high kinetic energy of the strike. As we all should know, the ground can hit harder than most of us ever could on our own. So being able to knock an opponent to the ground can be quite a devastating tactic. And all these benefits can be gained from a very short range movement that does not have high overheads in terms of space or time required for acceleration. These characteristics make the push strike an attractive option and well worth the training overheads. And now I'd like to discuss the push strike throw results. I'd like to take some credit here for almost seamlessly matching the impact velocity for these throw strikes. It might be a bit conceited, but I would like to take a little bit of credit for it. It's not easy to keep one's natural performance variation down to less than 0.5%. So for all intents and purposes, the velocity of the two different strike sets was identical, with the one variation being that I was not in contact with the stick for the thrown strikes at the point of impact. I would also like to point out how accurate the impulse block method is in terms of calculating the apparent mass of the thrown stick. The average calculated apparent mass for the thrown stick was 970 grams. And of course, in that example, we know for sure that because no part of my body was in contact with the stick at the point of impact, it's only the stick's mass that was involved in that impact, meaning that the apparent mass of the stick should equal its mass. Now the actual mass of the stick with the padding used in the tests was 886 grams, as opposed to 970 grams as measured using the impulse block method. This represents a measurement error of just over 9%. To put into perspective how ridiculously small this error is for the type of measurement being performed, one must consider that we are essentially weighing an object of less than 1 kilogram in mass, thrown at a load cell with a velocity that must be determined using a laser photogate timer, and then analyzing the force time curve of the object's impact, which typically lasts less than 30 milliseconds. If you would pardon the extreme analogy, it's a bit like timing an Olympic sprint event using one's perception of one's own heartbeat and getting a result that is accurate down to decimal places. As you can see from the table of results, the difference between the two sets of tests was typically very marked, with an average of nearly 900% difference between most characteristics, barring, of course, the impact velocity, which I attempted to make identical between the two tests, and the power. Power was only 24% lower for the Flute throws because of the much shorter impact duration. So even though the kinetic energy of the Flute throws was much lower than that of the push strikes, it was delivered over such a short impact duration that the power was still quite high. The remarkable differences that we can see in this table of results are fundamentally due to my ability to manipulate my apparent mass, or the apparent mass of my strike, at the point of impact. Hopefully, this set of remarkably different results demonstrates once and for all how complex human striking is in terms of the calculation of kinetic energy. One cannot make any kind of base assumption in terms of apparent mass in these kinds of calculations. If one, for instance, were to assume, in the case of my two-handed push strike, that the apparent mass behind my strike was simply the mass of the stick, one's result would be nearly 900% out. Neither can one assume that my apparent mass in these tests is typical of what could be expected from push strikes of this nature. The apparent mass that I'm generating is a result of a long period of training, in my case a few decades of training, in order to enhance and to improve the efficiency of my biomechanical advantage and my body systems. As an example, and for instance, a less experienced martial artist may not be able to harness as much of their biomechanical advantage as I'm able to, which could yield a significantly lower apparent mass, impulse, and kinetic energy. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and that you found it informative, and maybe you learned a little bit more about apparent mass in terms of human impact and human combat practice. I'll see you all again next time. Cheers.